In this video, we're going to look at ways to avoid the most common mistakes beginners make in exposure blending. So to start with, the first thing we want to avoid is misaligned layers. If we try to exposure blend layers that aren't aligned, we'll end up with black edging. Now, of course, misalignment can happen because we're shooting handheld, or because it was windy, or because the conditions weren't favorable. Naturally, if you're bracketing, you should try and have your camera on a tripod wherever possible. If you find you do have two exposures which aren't aligned correctly, you have to align them. So there are two ways to do this. We can automatically align them, or we can manually align them. If we're using smart objects, which is what we will be using later on down the line when the course gets a little bit more complex, then we can't use auto align. We have to manually align our layers. But let's look at both techniques anyway. So we've got my darker exposure here on top and the base exposure on the bottom. Look at the difference between those two exposures. They are completely misaligned. So in order to align them, we can select both layers, go to Edit and Auto Align Layers, and that will align the selected layers. Just press OK there. Now if we zoom in, we'll see that Photoshop's done an okay job there. And it's aligned the trees reasonably well too. And you'll find that most of the time auto align will do a good job with layers that aren't smart objects. Now if you do have smart objects, the other way to align your layers is to select your top layer, change the blend mode from normal to difference, then select the move tool, click once on your big image here and use the arrow keys on your keyboard to move them up, down, left and right until your layers are correctly aligned. And you'll know they're correctly aligned when there's no harsh edging. So this is the layers being misaligned. So you can see we have some white edging along here. And this is the layers correctly aligned. When that's done, of course, you change the blend mode back to normal. So that's the first way to avoid the most common mistake. Now another error we make sometimes is trying to exposure blend images that don't need exposure blending. So remember, we blend exposures in order to recover overexposed highlights or underexposed shadows. If your image has no overexposed highlights and no underexposed shadows, then you don't need to exposure blend. So let's look at the histogram here. We certainly have no overexposed highlights here, and look at the left hand side where the shadows are. You don't see a peak there in the histogram, so we don't have any clipped shadows. So this image doesn't need exposure blending. If we were to exposure blend, let's look at the result. We'd go to Lumi 32. We want to put the sky from the darker exposure, let's say, into the brighter exposure. Watch what happens when we try and make the mask. Immediately we can't get a selection of the sky because the sky isn't white in our base exposure. Our sky is correctly exposed for. So instead, what happens if we press apply, we'll see we end up with a really flat image. Again, this is because we don't need to exposure blend. Our base exposure is absolutely fine. And just in case you missed it in the beginning video, I quite like this image as monochrome. So if you ever edit an image, create a mask on Lumi 32, and you think, oh, that looks pretty good as a black and white image, you can just press image here and it will turn that layer into a black and white layer. So let's move on to the next point. This is all about which exposures we should be using when exposure blending, and it's one of the most important points we're going to cover in this whole tutorial. If we choose the wrong exposures, we simply can't get a good blend. Let me show you what I mean. I've got 4 exposures on here. The vast majority of times in exposure blending, I'll only need 2 exposures, sometimes 3, but we'll get into that more as the course progresses. Now on top we have a really dark exposure. Underneath that we'll have another dark exposure. Underneath that our base exposure, and underneath that a brighter exposure. So let's say we want to blend these exposures. Really all we'll need is the second darkest exposure, not the most dark, and this medium exposure here. That has all the information we need to make this a good blend. If we try to blend in this really dark exposure, it's going to look unnatural because this exposure is too dark. Now I'm going to show you an example of that. And I'm just going to choose a crude selection. So here's the lasso tool, and I'm going to select the sky in the base exposure, just to show you what I mean about it being too dark. Then, with this super dark exposure selected, I'll create a mask on that. And of course, that's a crude selection. But look at how dark the sky is compared to the rest of the image. It looks completely unnatural. The two simply don't go together. We need a brighter exposure. Now, a quick workaround is actually to create a curves layer on top of this darker exposure. Press this button here, which clips it to that exposure, which means it will only affect that exposure. And just bring up the brightness levels of that layer. And you'll see the blend looks more natural. Now, it won't look very natural because we used a crude selection here along the mountains. But it does look more natural than without that curves layer. In fact, it looks so dark it has a kind of end of the world look about it. So let's look at what happens if we blend in the slightly brighter exposure that we've got here. So this darker exposure is ideal because not only does it have all of our tones accounted for, so no overexposed areas. I mean, we've got a little bit of brightness here, but it's not too bad. It's also not too dark in terms of the foreground. So that makes the blending a little bit smoother. Watch what happens now if I copy this selection that we made earlier and put the mask on that exposure instead. You see how much more natural that is compared to the last exposure. So that's the one before, and that's the brighter exposure. So when choosing your darker exposures, try to choose the exposure which is dark enough to have as much information as possible in the sky, but not to be too dark that the blend will be unnatural. So let's delete these masks and do that in terms of exposure blending. So with my darker exposure invisible, I'm not going to create a black mask because I'm just going to paint in this selection very crudely. I'm going to press Brights 1 because we want to select the sky. Now that's already a pretty good selection of the sky, but we can make it a bit more contrasting. And now we've got a really good selection of the sky and we're omitting much of the foreground. And I can press Apply. And you see how natural that final effect is. Now you may be saying that the darker exposure has some better textures and recovered areas in these highlights here. And you may be right. Now later on down the line, we're going to look at different ways that we can play with our raw files so that we would pull that information back in this darker exposure that we've used. But for now, just for good practice, I'm going to show you what we can do in order to recover that sky there. So I'm going to hold Alt and create a black mask by clicking on this layer. You can hold Option if you're using Mac. We can make that darker exposure visible. And now we just want to make a selection of that area of the sky. And you see it's really bright on this big image, so we should be able to make a mask from it. And we want to make a really tight mask, a contrasting mask that selects few tones, so I've gone for a Brights 3. And you see that area is much brighter than the areas around it. If you want, you can bring down the range and that will make it even more contrasting. Then we press Select. You see we have the marching ants here. We press Command and H or Control and H to hide them. We select the mask of our layer, choose a white paintbrush, and I will just gently paint in this area. You see it's a little bit dark just as it was last time, so we can bring down the opacity of that layer. And I'm going to press Command and D or Control and D, and that deselects the active selection. We have to do that every time we finish exposure blending. So there's before and after. I think that looks okay. But it isn't the cleanest job, and we'll see better ways to do this later on. Now, just as we can choose an exposure which is too dark for blending, we can also choose an exposure which is too bright. So this is our base exposure, as I said before. And it's got everything we need. It's got a decently exposed foreground. Now remember, we don't want the foreground to be too bright. This is shot just after sunset, so it should be slightly darker. It wouldn't make sense to have a foreground which is as bright as if it was midday. So that's why those two blend together nicely. However, if we use the foreground below, you see I've got this other exposure which is extremely bright. Watch what happens. So this is the blended result before. Now if I make this base exposure invisible and we just use the brighter exposure for the foreground, look at how unnatural that looks. Again, the blend just doesn't work. We can do what we did before and choose a curves layer and a clipping mask, and we can bring down the brightness of that layer, but it's not the cleanest or most efficient way of doing that. It will fix the problem, but we're better off avoiding it rather than fixing it. So the lesson here is, when choosing your exposures, choose the darkest exposure which has enough information in the highlights to work with, but don't go for a super dark exposure which is near black, because blending that into a brighter exposure will be very, very difficult. And when choosing your brighter exposure, try not to choose one that's too bright. Think about the scene. If it's an evening shot, then the foreground or the brighter exposure shouldn't be too bright anyway, because it would look unnatural. Now the next thing I want to look at, and I get this email a lot by people new to luminosity masks. They often ask me why they're able to paint outside their selection. What I mean by that is, they'll create a mask and they'll be painting that mask in, and it will be affecting the tones that they don't want to affect. And inevitably, it's always because we have a mask which is not contrasting enough. So I'm going to create a black mask on my dark exposure here. I'm going to create a brights 1 mask. So often what I'll find is the user's mask will be really, really general. In other words, if we just want to select the sky, then the sky should be bright or really light grey, and the areas we don't want to select should be black or very dark grey. But with a selection like this, watch what happens. So I've selected that, and I've chosen the mask of the darker exposure. Got a white brush, Command and H to hide the marching ants, or Control and H. I'm going to make this invisible. Now watch, I'm painting in the sky, which is great, but watch what happens to the foreground too. We're flattening the foreground. And that's because we didn't make a mask that was contrasting enough. So look at our mask that we've just created. Because we can see much of this path, and it's basically made of lighter greys, that means it's affected in the mask. So I press Command and D or Control and D to deselect that active selection. Delete that mask. Now watch what happens if we make a more contrasting mask. I'm going to go back to brights 1. I'm going to bring the range down a little bit because we're selecting some of these midtones that we don't want to select. So now we're selecting few of those midtones. Actually, I'll go back to what it was before. Let's say around 73. But by reducing the range, we've also excluded some of the sky from the mask. You see it's turned grey. So smoothness will create more contrast between those tones. You see that? And we can amplify that selection to make the sky even wider. Now I think this mask is actually too contrasting, so I'm going to bring down smoothness a little bit more. If we have a mask which is completely black and completely white, that can often make really harsh transitions between the brighter exposure and the darker exposure. So if I press select here, now you'll notice I forgot to put on a black mask on that layer. So if I just click this layer right now, it will apply the mask that we created. And it still gives us the same result because we don't need to actually paint in that mask. You see, we're affecting far fewer tones than what we were than if we had an active selection. And this leads us nicely on to the final point. So let's go back to this exact example. When exposure blending, we need to make sure our brush settings are at normal and our flow is at 100%. If our flow is, let's say, 50%, we're going to create a patchy sky. So I'm going to create that brights 1 mask again. I'm going to bring down the range a touch, bring up amplification, and let's leave it at that for now. Then I'm going to press select. I'm going to choose the mask. With a white brush, press Command and H to hide the marching ants, and maybe a smaller brush just to show you what I mean by this. And watch, if I start brushing in here, you can go over, if you've set a different flow without taking your finger off the mouse button, you can go over the same area and it reinforces that area. And what happens is you end up with a patchy sky. So let's have a look. You see, you end up with this areas that are grey rather than white. And that isn't what you want. So I can demonstrate that more clearly with the less contrasting mask. So let me delete that. Lumi 32 again, a black mask on this darker exposure. This time let's go for a brights 1 that has a little bit more contrast, but not too much. Bring the range down a little bit more. So I'll press select. choose the mask with a white paintbrush already selected, and watch what happens in some of these areas. You see, when I went back over it, I was able to reinforce the selection, but it creates a very patchy final result. Now watch what happens if I don't do that. So I'm going to go back and undo those changes, select the mask again, and I'm going to set flow to 100%. Now with a big brush, I'm going to hold down my left mouse button and paint over the whole sky in one sweep. You see? So we're creating a consistent change, and it doesn't matter how many times you go over this same area, we're not reinforcing the selection. We're not making areas patchy. And of course I can do some in the water here. So let's look at the mask. The sky doesn't have those patchy lines from the brush. Now the good news is, when you're masking like I've done, we can actually go over our selection multiple times to reinforce it. So let's say if I disable this mask, you'll see the sky in the darker exposure actually has some great darker tones. The clouds had some really good depth to them. But because they're in the mask, the clouds are partially selected. You see the clouds on the horizon here and in the top right. That means they're not coming through fully from this darker exposure. Watch if I disable the mask. Look at the clouds. That's what the clouds really look like. But in this mask, they haven't come through. But we don't have to do anything other than paint over the sky again. Watch this. See, we reinforce the selection, making them nice and dark, but we're not affecting the tones outside of the sky. Essentially, if you have tones in your mask that are grey, light grey, mid grey, then we can paint over them again and again, and that will reinforce them. So we come out with a much better final result. And as I mentioned before, whenever we finish exposure blending or painting in an active selection, we have to press Command and D or Control and D to deselect that selection. So those are the most common errors in exposure blending that you now know how to avoid.